Yes, now good morning, everyone. We're going to start right away with Key and Shake, presenting the Revitalizing Without Native Speakers, Computational Grammar, Corpus Expansion, and Community Support. Kian is a master's student in linguistics at the University of São Paulo. He is supervised by Dr. Thomas Daniel Fimbo, and he researches computational grammar and the revitalization of Old Tupi in collaboration with the Potiguara, Tupinambá, and Tupinambá de Olivença communities. And outside of academia, he also shares linguistics and Tupi content on Instagram. Kian, you're very welcome. The stage is yours.
And without further ado, let's start. I'll be talking, of course, about revitalization without native speakers. Um, all right, so we're going to be using the term Old Tupi to talk about the language that I work with. Old Tupi, what is it? It's the general language of Brazil. As we know, the Iberian colonial agenda was to grab a generic language, like in Mexico, we had Nahuatl, in Paraguay, we have Guarani, we had Quechua, and other places. In Brazil, we had Old Tupi, which was called Língua Geral. It's from the first contact up until around the middle of the 18th century that we start to see structural differences. And so Old Tupi is a modern term that we use to describe this specific phase of the general language. It's the predecessor of what we call today Nheengatu. It has a very healthy sized corpus. Like there's quite a lot of stuff when I compare it to other languages. We have European explorers talking about their trips to Brazil, natural encyclopedia, Jesuit clergies writing grammars, catechisms, poems, and plays. And the only actual indigenous writing that we have in this language are from a family of Potiguara that were sending letters back and forth from each other. So we have a good amount of info about this language. This map here I made, and I'm still working on it. It's not. It's a questionable map, so don't try to cite it or anything. Take a screenshot after, but it should get better. But this should give you a general idea as to the general distribution around the 16th century as to the speakers of Tupi. If you see in blue, these nations in blue, Potiguara, Tabajara, Caete, Tupinambá, these would all have been Tupi speaking peoples. Whereas you see in orange, these would have been what they call Tapuyas, or the other non Tupi speaking people. Here in green, you can see Guarani, which for whatever reason was not considered part of the Brazilian língua geral, even though they're very similar languages, I think probably due to political reasons. But that's the general idea. So eventually we see the fall of Língua Geral. Marques do Pombal prohibited it in Maranhão and Grão-Pará in the 18th century. And then it continues for about 100 years in these mass waves of migration, both from the Nordeste into Amazonas and also from Europe into the Sudeste, right, the southeast of Brazil. They start to dilute the linguistic landscape, and we start to see more monolingualism in Portuguese start to crop up in these coastal indigenous communities. And that's pretty much where we're at today. Who's using Tupi today? Who's still using Old Tupi? So we have Potiguara and Paraíba, Tabajara as well, except I don't work with them directly as much. Tupinambá in Olivença, and Tupiniquim in Espírito Santo. So these are the three main indigenous peoples who are still around today. The same peoples from hundreds of years ago with first contact, and as I said, they've moved into this monolingual context. But for the past about 20 years, it kind of started in the year 2000 in most of these places. They've all been going back to these old texts, these old Jesuit texts, and trying to revitalize their language based on these things. And in general, just Brazilians like to learn about Tupi. If you speak Portuguese, you've said paçoca. Even if you speak English, there's a lot of words, maraca, tapir, cashew. We're speaking Tupi, right? So you and I, Nyande, Tupi has exclusivity. You and I, we all speak Tupi. So the current issue with Tupi is that the corpus is extremely inaccessible, right? It's a big corpus, but it's dispersed throughout the world. We have stuff in Portugal, Rio, São Paulo, even Netherlands, and facsimiles are rare and expensive usually for these kind of works. We have online PDFs, but they have low quality imaging, and sometimes they don't have OCR. And some texts lack translation, right? So some of these texts are just monolingual Tupi text that people can't make too much sense of. So there's rare access. They're dense and they're antiquated texts in this old Portuguese, oftentimes mixing Latin in out of nowhere, and they have inconsistent orthographies and a religious focus. The religious focus is a big thing for me, and I'll touch on that in a little bit. But I think when people are revitalizing their languages and the languages are documented with this history of colonial violence, that can be a big deterrent for people when the only sources they have to learn the language cause them to relive that generational violence. I think that that can be a big deterrent as well. So a lot of the historical context tied up in these texts can be a big deterrent. So just to show you guys some of these orthographies, here's the Catechism of Araújo from 1618. Here's the Vocabulario da Língua Brasílica, same term. So this one is Erei putu bom, you help them. Anya em putu bom, you speak in favor of them. Putu bom sarama, what will be helped. And then ase putu bom sabamo, the way that in the condition of what will help us. So you can see that here we have pretty different orthographies in each of these texts, but it's the same root in each of these. So this is the kind of stuff that we're leading with, where if you run OCR on this, it might not even pick up the text the exact way that it is. So when we go to actually digitize these and put these into a more standard form, it's a lot of manual work. And yeah, this root means help. So while I talk about these things, it's important that I think you remember that this talk applies to you, right? We're all here talking about indigenous, endangered languages, not always indigenous, but just endangered languages. And as I talk about some of the things I'm working on, some of my perspectives, I really want you to think about similarities and differences in the realities of the languages that you study and speak, that you're concerned about, and think about would this stuff apply to what you're doing? And write those questions down, because hopefully we'll have 10 minutes after, if I don't go over too long, to talk about questions and talk about these things. So the motivating question for our talk today is, how can we expand accessibility to a low resource language with no more L1 speakers, right? We don't have anybody to ask. All we can ask is the corpus, right? So the first thing, I'll give you a little introduction on myself. How can I, Kian Sheik, help language revitalization? Some of my personal skills, I have a bachelor's in data science. So I'm not originally from the linguistics field. I'm a programmer with more than 10 years of tech experience doing data engineering, back-end engineering, app engineering, you name it, I've done it. And I grew up in a multilingual upbringing. So my dad is an immigrant from Iran. I grew up with Farsi being spoken in the house, and also I grew up near the border with Mexico and California. So my linguistic landscape was bilingual with Spanish, and then in the house there was Farsi. So I've always had to deal with many languages. And on top of that, I also have some indigenous ancestry. My great grandmother was born in an indigenous reservation, and she ended up leaving the Muskogee Nation. So my grandfather, due to discrimination, was not given this language, right? And so myself and my mother, because we now live in a time where there's not so much discrimination towards indigenous languages, it feels somewhat of like a responsibility that and a yearning that, I want to learn my language, right, of my family. And so I've been a student of this program for multiple years, and Muskogee has not completely died out, although COVID has done a big blow on us. So I have a personal perspective of how it feels to learn a language that you didn't grow up with, but feels like it should be yours. And I know how that feels from the learner's standpoint. So I think that I can bring some perspective in that. And aside from that, I have a social media reach for some reason. When I post videos, people watch them. Sometimes not always liking them, but people watch them. And I could collaborate with this channel called Tupinambá, which is from my friend. We post videos. The last video we posted got 250,000 views, and the video was simply reading the first chapter of Anchieta's grammar. in language that people can digest. 250,000 views, right? And that's a grammar from 1595. So needless to say that the public craves access to this, but it's just locked up in these libraries, right? Um, and so one of the things I'm going to transition now is, what is my perspective on this as a data scientist? My perspective is that everything is data and data is everything, right? You have a car, you can describe it by its color, price, kilometers, things like that. Then you've got a class and objects. We have ASCII, it's just a bunch of binary, right? These letters that we use. When you look at certain morphemes, they're just tags, right? Each of these tags is just a unique number that describes what that morpheme is. We're living in this data where everything has a hierarchical structure. You can describe things as trees. Even music is data, right? So a lot of people ask, like, oh, what is this programmer doing in the humanities? I think it's important that we understand that even humanities is data. And so in the case of a dormant language, we cannot ask L1 speakers for guidance, right? We must ask the corpus. As much as I acknowledge that a corpus does not represent the entire linguistic reality of a language, in these contexts, this is our reality. And so we must accept the fact that the corpus is the language for all intents and purposes. So in order to do these things, it requires a lot of linguistic and language specific knowledge, which lay people don't always have. People in revitalization projects don't always have. It's prohibitive to the casual and heritage learner, right? And so, regardless of whether it's prohibitive or not, what I've seen in my practice is that people will attempt to use this data regardless, whether they're understanding the grammar or not. They will try to use the language that they deserve to use, right? Rightfully so. And so, understanding that this is going to happen as much as we might not want it to, it's our responsibility as people who understand these languages and have access to these languages to actually reproduce this material in a digestible and accessible form to the people who deserve it, right? And so when I thought about that, the first thing that comes to my mind is, what is the most important material for learning Old Tupi? That would be the Dictionary of Old Tupi by Eduardo Navarro, right? This is an amazing work that collects many different words, citations, sources, morphological properties. It's really an amazing piece of work to start off your learning journey in Tupi Antigo. And so, is it accessible? In 25 years of active Potiguara revitalization, the indigenous schools in Paraíba have not received a single copy of this book from the government, right? And so they're actively trying to get their language. We have materials that they could be using, but there's no connection there. And so this is a good place for us to start, right, as researchers. So what's the reality of the Potiguara? The reality of these coastal indigenous peoples is that everybody has cell phones, right? Everybody's using their phone. People have phones now. And when you're in the classroom, maybe you can't afford to buy a bunch of these textbooks, but you could ask everyone to go to a QR code or a website, right, and do that. So an important process is getting the dictionary, cleaning it into a digestible computational format, right? In my case, I made a JSON, but it could be anything. And then we parse that using code, right? We parse those different properties of these grammatical things. Maybe your language has gender, maybe it has another thing. We need to consider those things. And then once you have the data, it's just a question of putting a little front end to it, right? So this simple HTML5 hosted page, there's no server, there's no backend, it's just a client. And it's hosted in GitHub Pages, which is a completely free hosting server. So this dictionary is completely free for me to post. All I have to do is maintain it, right? And so now everybody has access to this dictionary. And we can see that word that I was showing you before, petibon, which means to help somebody. It's right there, and you can see how amazing Navajo's dictionary is. So quickly, I want to jump into some linguistics now. Tupi-Guarani verbal morphology is complex. You've heard of nominative accusative and you've heard of ergative absolutive. Well, we've got split ergative absolutive, and that means that we have both of these things in Tupi. So I'm gonna try to keep this quick. I don't want to go too deep, but I'm really trying to scare you right here with all these details. So every verb in Tupi can have a feature, right? Traços, as how we say in Portuguese. We can have an agent trace or a patient trace. If a verb only has an agent trace, then it's an active morphology intransitive verb. If it only has a stative trace, then it's a stative intransitive verb, which has a stative morphology. If it has both traces, then it's transitive, right? Okay. So this is what these prefixes look like for the active. We have a, oro, ya, ere, pe, o. And the patient, we have she, ore, yanden, de, pe, which you can think of as accusative. That's how Anchieta calls it, which is not too far off, to be honest with you. And then we have these interesting morphemes here, which are a little bit different. This table is a table I've been working on, which describes the person hierarchy in Tupi. In Tupi, the first person is more important than the second person, which is more important than the third person. So when I'm talking, I'm going to mark myself first, always, whether you're doing the action to me or whether I'm doing the action to you. The first person hierarchy gets marked first, right? And we can see that here in this green, green, orange, orange, green, green, orange, orange. That's when the agent has a greater or equal hierarchy, valency in the hierarchy, we get an active morphology. Whereas here, we have green, orange, orange, green, green, orange, orange, green. Now it's flipped, you see? So how do you explain this to a student? How did I figure this out, right? Like I've been reading these texts for a while and I kind of put it together. It's because I've implemented a conjugator. I have a lot of patience and I've been doing academic research of languages that are similar to Tupi, right? We can't expect students to go through this process, right? To do all this kind of research and to get it. So we need a way of showing them this grammar like a baby without actually simplifying it, right? We always run the risk of simplification. So my idea was to, well, this was for my own learning, is how do I learn how to conjugate verbs in Tupi? Well, what if I can create a program that just conjugates them for me? If I'm reading from a grammar and the grammar has a list of instructions that says, when there's this letter, do this, when there's this letter, do that, when there's this letter, do this, why can't I just tell Python to do that, right? And so what I found is that I can. And so now, on top of the dictionary that's just Navajo's dictionary, now we have expanded paradigms inside the dictionary where you can go in the dictionary and you can see how to conjugate each of these specific cases based on the inputs and the parameters, the mood, the negation. On top of that, now that we have this data, we can start doing passive learning, right? And this is how I learned how to conjugate Tupi. Once I made this data, looking at the things, I made this quiz so that I could teach myself. And so the way this quiz works is it just picks a random verb, conjugates it with random parameters, and then it asks you to guess what those parameters are. So in this example, we have ore monduk a e. A common misconception for Portuguese learners learning Tupi is that the first thing is going to be the subject and the second thing is going to be the object, right? That's the automatic knee-jerk reaction, but that's not how Tupi works. And so if I have to sit there and explain, well, no, it's because there's an object hierarchy and the first person's more important than the second person. No, no, no. The easier thing is just do it 20 times in the quiz, and eventually your brain will not let you fail. You know, if you see the same thing and you make the same mistake 20 times, the human mind is amazing. Eventually it'll say, okay, I get it. I don't know why, but this is the way that it is. And just to talk about some of the analytics on this dictionary, the year-to-date analytics, I looked at this last night. On the dictionary page, there was 32,700 views. So that many views just on the dictionary this year, which 6,739 active users. And the sentence quiz is being used by about 223 active users. Mind you, I don't advertise this stuff. I don't pay for Google. This is just organic traffic, you know. I just put this website. If you build it, they will come. And some of the top cities are São Paulo, Rio, Fortaleza, Natal, Salvador, João Pessoa, as we might expect. So, how am I on time? I have like 10 minutes. We have a verbal conjugator, right? We have a clause conjugator, but can we go further? We're making verbs, but can we do the rest? I mean, language has a lot of stuff going on. Can we do the rest? If Anchieta could describe the whole language on 50 little pages with medieval Portuguese, why can't I do it with a huge computer and Python, right? He was working with so much less than I am. So this is where I start to come to my theory of how I implement the syntax or the morphology of the language. And so I'm going to throw some theories at you just so that you can kind of maybe grab onto something you're familiar with. But the implementation that we have here to actually show grammar computationally is fairly unique, and it's going to need its own theory for explanation. But it's very similar to how we think of distributed morphology. We start with a predicate class, which all classes inherit from. And I apologize if this is too much computer science. I'll try to go through it quickly. And then the eval method of that class, that object, is the spell out, right? And so basically we create this structure and then we call evaluate. When we call evaluate, then it does the spell out and we get an orthographic and a semantic representation of what we're looking at. And so the predicate class is the base of this framework, which I'm working on for my master's project. Basically, any given predicate can have n necessary internal arguments, right? These are complements, and infinite adjuncts. You can just put adjuncts on. So that looks a lot like how we think about X bar, how you have a head, you have complements, which are internal arguments, and then you have your external adjuncts. And so that's how everything works in our conception of grammar in this thing. And so inside we have encapsulated variables like gender or mood or things which are morphological features, which are contained inside of the predicate. So every grammatical type is a predicate, right? A noun is a predicate. A verb is a predicate that takes either intransitive one argument or two if it's transitive, or bipartite transitive, or whatever, three arguments sometimes. You have prepositions, well, in our language, postpositions, which take a noun argument, right? You have deverbals, which take a verb argument and return a noun. So you're able to really abstractify, we can abstract a lot of this. And so we use this merge operator, which is the star, the asterisk, to merge these two things together. And C selection, right? The category selection is what's going to say, oh, this one is a noun and this one's a verb. So the noun is going to be the argument of the verb because verbs don't become arguments of nouns, right? In some cases, that's not always possible. So you have to be a little bit more specific with the directionality of it. But the example would be if I have tu as an argument to falar, it will maintain the directionality. We get tu falas, right? But if I say falar argument tu, now we're putting the directionality, the PF will take that into consideration. You get falas tu, it'll put the pronoun afterwards, right? So that's the basic idea of how we're defining this. Then we have the plus operator, which is a merge for adjuncts, right? Which is just putting it in a different spot. The C selection works not as well right now. I think I could maybe make it better with adjuncts, but because of this, we also have these two operators, two carets to indicate directionality to say what's being adjuncted onto what. Because in certain cases, like verbs, when you want to make one verb an adjunct of the other verb, subordination, you need directionality because it's not obvious as to which one will become the subordinate because they're equal in valency. Then we have this operator slash, which is like it's a composition operator for roots. So atang means strong, katu means good. So Atang-Gatu or very. So Atang-Gatu would be really strong. This is maybe a Tupi specific thing, but perhaps this is a feature that is more abstracted to other languages. But we're able to put nuclear roots together to create new nuclear roots in Tupi, which is pretty interesting. So each time that we do an operation like this, we return an immutable copy of the same object so that when we go use it again somewhere else in the code, we don't have artifacts left over like, oh, you still have the argument from that last sentence you were writing left in this verb. That won't happen. And, we have the spell out, which is the evaluate. So once you've built this structure, then you call evaluate, and then you get some amazing outputs, which we're going to explore right now. So all of this was too abstract. Let's look at some concrete examples first. Okay? So we're going to write this first line here. Oreru ubacape tequar, imoete puramonderere toiko. Padre nossa que estás no céu, santificado seja teu nome. Okay, so Father, our Father, who art thou in heaven, hallowed be thy name. So this is what we're going to translate here. So the first thing we can start with is let's try to make this adjunct. We have heaven ubaka. We define the phonetic information, right? The literal raw phonetic information that we need to pass is here. Then we pass it through the noun function, which creates this predicate of a noun, which has the definition heaven, and it has this. And so you can see when we go to generate an output of that, you get the PF up here, the phonetic form, which is ubaka. You have the type noun, and then you have the semantic, the encyclopedic knowledge, which will be here, the sky, heaven, paradise, right? And so that's how you get that. The second you want to put it as an argument to a preposition, for example, pe, which is the locative, we have it defined here. We say locative is taking one argument, which is heaven. And that's shown by this graph. The green is an argument. The blue is a predicate, which is taking an argument. And this yellow color is the final form. That's what it looks like once we render out the spell out. Okay. And so I guess I just said all those things that I had written there. So let's continue on. So we have the next line, ubaku petekwa, this next little clause here. So the next thing, we have this verb, which is iko, which means either to be or to live, to live somewhere, to be. And then we have a deverbal sara, right? So we're defining deverbals as this type of predicate which takes a verb as an input and it returns a noun as an output, right? We can be very abstract with these predicates. And so what happens is we pass iko in, we add on these adjunct to it, and then when we pass it through the sada, the noun maintains the adjunct that the verb had before. We could add the adjunct on after the sada or before. That doesn't matter because the spell out will result in the same, it'll result in the same PF, right? So a lot of these questions and a lot of morphosyntax is really like, we really need to get this right. Do we put the adjunct first or do we put the sada first? For our practical intentions of making these things more accessible and learning better about them, we are just mostly trying to get something that works. It doesn't have to be perfect, right? And so, yeah. So then we move on. When we have nouns, for example, when we have two nouns together, they start to create this genitive relationship, this possessive relationship. That's just how I defined it. You can really define this however you'd like. So if uba is the root that means father, then it will take in the argument, the first person plural exclusive. So ours, not yours. Us, not you. So our father, not you, because I'm talking to God, so it wouldn't include him, obviously. So oreru. You notice here that I put a vocative annotation on here. The vocative is not a predicate because the vocative is inside, right? So I think you get the idea a little bit as to how this works. We combine things and we save them into variables, and little by little we create this nested structure that goes on top of each other. Here's another deverbal ete, or here's a causative rather, right? A lot of people think of causative as this big thematic thing. Here we're defining as a predicate. A causative is a morpheme that takes an intransitive verb or a noun and it returns a transitive verb, right? It's much more simple that way, to think of it that way. So as we go, we make this, and I'll hurry up because I think I'm running out of time a little bit. But the final result is this first line here where we can see each node of the hierarchy. We can see the spell out that's happening. We see ete, that means true. Moete, to make true, to honor. Moete puro, what is honored. Moete puramo, as what is honored, right? Orerub, our father. Urbaka petekwar, one who lives in heaven. And so what we have is this, all of these trees that you're seeing here are generated automatically from the grammar. I didn't make these trees. I just wrote a little function that said tree, and it gave me this tree because the structure is inside of our syntax as we defined the structure, right? And I didn't tell it that you have to put this R here because that's programmed into the actual morpheme itself. So what we're doing here is we have utterance modeling, right? We can model pretty much any utterance that we see in a way that we can get a really nice structure, and we can get a PF and an LF, a phonetic form and a logical form. So one of the cool side effects of that is when we spit out this annotated morphemically annotated output, we can spit out the output of the PF and the LF, and we can give it to an LLM who has had zero training on the Tupi language, and it has all of this linguistic information as to the hierarchy of the sentence, what this morpheme means, what the definition of this is, what the definition of that is. And when you ask it to give you a translation, it gives you a good translation. Obviously, here in this case, it's a commonly known prayer. So the LLM probably saw it and caught on and said, okay, I've seen this before. This is our Father. But I rest assured, I've tried this with random sentences, and it gives pretty satisfactory translations. And of course, it's doing that because I've taken the time to encode all of that information. But I did it in a way that was elegant and simple, that you just kind of put the stuff where they go, and you didn't have to say, you didn't actually have to model everything, right? And so that's really neat. So what does that mean? So what, right? Okay, we can do that. Some of the amazing things, my ideas about this are, you can have a search engine for morphemes in a corpus. Imagine you have a whole text that's been transcribed in this, and you want to say, oh, I saw this morpheme and sometimes it acts like this, but sometimes it acts like this. Well, I can write code that runs in less than a second that will look at all the morphemes around it, and it'll compare those contexts and tell you, oh, in this context, it's more likely to do this. In this context, it's more likely to do that. Then we can take those probabilities that we've learned, and we can start generating synthetic data with other verbs that would make sense in those contexts using those structures. So now we're moving from a low resource context to an infinite resource context, right? Where we can create as much data as we want, and this data is extremely highly annotated. Another thing which I've been doing is I've been teaching a class online inspired by Libras. I did a class on Libras, and I was amazed by how I was able to learn the language without talking, without any sort of input with my first language or second language. And so what I've been trying to do is repeat that. And as I make these apostillas, this is what it looks like. I define the verb here, I define the structure I want, and I give it a label. And then the code does the rest. You see how there's a difference between Tupi Antigo orthography. The Potiguara have their own orthography today that they like to use. The Tupinambá de Olivença have democratically voted upon an orthography, right? And so how do you capture all that? How do you maintain all this? The way you maintain it is by automating it, right? So all I'm doing is defining the structure up here. The PF is just a representation. It can be a tree. It can be orthography in Potiguara. It can be semantic, right? The thing that you're spitting out is arbitrary. The value is the fact that we have this data in the computer memory now, right? And so what does this look like for those of you who might want to follow this process? The process looks, you grab some old text, right? Then you go and you write it out in my framework of code. Once you've written out this old text, you regenerate the text that you just wrote out, and you go back and you make sure that your new, nice, standard, modern orthography and what you just transcribed, those are the same. Once you have the human approval on that, you stick that in a unit test file, right? And you go back and you do the next line. Every time you change anything, you regenerate the entire corpus, because it takes a second. Computers are really fast. That way, every time you make a change, you can be sure that you're not breaking things in the past. And so you have this iterative bootstrap where each line you encounter new morphemes that you haven't implemented yet. You go back and implement them, and then you make sure it doesn't break what you've already implemented, and you implement and you implement. Eventually, you've implemented the whole document, and now you know that that grammar that you've implemented can faithfully recreate the style that you were trying to take out of that text in the first place. And so that's really what I'm trying to develop here, is a method that we can take from Tupi Antigo and put it in the context of other languages. And so my goal right now that I have it in a form, I have the code written, the theories there, I have it in a form where all my rest of the work is just doing this process of perfecting, implementing, perfecting, implementing. An amazing side effect of that is once I'm done implementing the corpus, I can generate facsimiles in whatever orthography I want, right? I can have them completely annotated. I can have every single sentence in my book have a syntax tree with it, right? Things that a human could never do alone are now possible once we start to forget about this antiquated way of, storing language in orthographic, just letters. We have computers now. We can store more than just the letters, right? And so that's kind of what I'm trying to say here. And so just for you to get an example, this is the line that we generated, but with all of that uh, morphemic annotation. Ore, possessive pronoun, first person plural exclusive. Are, pluriform prefix. Ub, root, vocative. Ubak, root, substantive suffix, consonant ending. These are all things that are in the grammar that as we add it in, these tags just get added in. I don't have to add them in. It's part of how I define these morphemes in the grammar, right? And so it's extremely useful because what if I got one of these wrong? Well, I just go back to my code, I fix it, and I regenerate everything. Had I done all that by hand, forget it. I'll just publish it. Who cares? Right? Like so it keeps us a little bit more accountable as well. Um, and so yeah, so here's some of my references and Auyabete, Aikwab, Kwekatu, all different ways of saying thank you in modern Tupi, revitalized Tupi. And I'll open it for questions.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Kian. Kwekaturete. Now we have 7 minutes for questions from the audience. I would like to ask you, please, before asking the question, if you could raise your hand so that I could call your name and then nobody talks over anyone.
And you can speak any language. I'll respond in Portuguese if it's more comfortable.
Yes, Gloria.
Hi. Sorry, I was looking for the raise hand thing.
There
I
is
have
no
a
raise-
comment. There is.
Go ahead.
You can also raise your hand in the camera.
Okay.
You can shift for that as well.
Okay.
Go.
Okay. So first of all, that's so cool. Though, in an assignment for computational linguistics, I tried to do a translator for Old Tupi, and it was very humbling to say the least. I was so innocent. I got as far as building the JSON document that you talked about in the beginning of the presentation. It's really difficult because although we have a lot of data, as you said, it's not enough data because LLMs need a lot of data. Anyway, so this is amazing work. And the question is if the community is participating in the process, not exactly as for consultated, because you said they cannot be consulted. They don't know the language, and the program, the code knows more because this language is not spoken right now. But if they are participating in for learning the process, maybe just because nowadays everything has to involve the community, right? And so if they are inside the process, that's it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It certainly is humbling when you try to make a translator for a language that's a low resource, and that's partially why I'm trying to do this, is to try to say, hey, if humans can understand these languages, how can we turn the description into data? That's basically what it is. It's like we've got this condensed human metalinguistic description. We just need to turn it into data somehow, right? And we have to do that in a responsible way. And as to your question about involving the community, yeah, there are generally how it works from what I've seen is that there's kind of like some leaders in the community who really step up, and they're not necessarily official leaders, but they really take the role of being like the language guardian of the community. For example, in Potiguar, it's Romildo, who's currently doing a master's himself. And so he's very involved in this, but one of the big things is also code literacy, right? Even within, just Fefeleshi, if I were to try and grab a random student and say, hey, come learn how to transcribe this stuff in Python, right? Like it might be a little bit daunting for a lot of people. And so some of the things that I've been trying to do is create tools and interfaces to use this stuff without doing it through code. So to make it more of a user interface. But I haven't gotten there yet so far. But in terms of working with the community, in the implementation, not as much, because the focus right now is to implement Tupi Antigo itself. And so that doesn't so much involve the community. What involves the community is when we start to talk about neologisms, and the amount that they're going to rely on this, right? And so for me, I see it as my job is to, as a linguist, to make it as close as possible to the way that we have proof that their ancestors spoke. Whether they're going to use that, that is up to them. Whether they're going to take that stuff and say, oh, this indicativo dois is so complicated, we're just going to conjugate it the normal way. That's up to them, right? But, if I come to them and I give them something that I simplified because I thought, or, maybe I tell them and they say, that's too complicated. My goal here is to make a tool for Tupi Antigo that researchers can use, Brazilians can use, app developers can use, anybody can use, teachers, and also indigenous communities can use. And so they're definitely the first users that I'm thinking of. But yeah, in the actual documentation, because it's a dead language, like I said, the point of this project is to kind of keep them away from needing to do that, right? And I kind of mentioned this before, like when I go through Muskogee, a hard thing really is reading through these old documents, and you get these feelings of emotion and harsh memories and things like that. You think about, like in our case, we had the Trail of Tears. There was all kinds of stuff that happened to the Potiguara as well. So being able to isolate them from that, I think, is a kind of a benefit from this project as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have 1 minute left for a very quick question. Yes, Evan, please.
Yeah, it's actually I had the similar questions to Gloria as well. But I mean, what I'm really, if it's allowed to do a personal question, just to get to know you a little bit better. How did you end up? Like, if you are in California and you are also a native, or you are associated to a native group as well. How do you end up in Brazil, in São Paulo, working on Tupi? Just a few, if you like, to share your journey with us, because that's so interesting.
Yeah, well, I ended up in São Paulo for, a random, it's a long story, but I basically, my girlfriend, Union Stable, there's no word for this. She's Brazilian. So I ended up here for love, basically. But I've always loved languages, as I said. And like, I learned Portuguese before I got here. And when I got here, there were words that I didn't learn, like anhangabaú, pamonha, paçoca. And when I ask Brazilians, what does this mean? They say, não sei, right? And so I started looking deeper. I said, well, does somebody know? And I went a little deeper, and then I found these books from Navajo, and it just happens that I moved right next to the University of Sao Paulo. So I went to his classes as a listener, and then I did it. And so I think probably my background is what pushed me to want to learn an indigenous language of the land that I live on, because to me that's just personally a sign of respect. Like, I feel weird living in Brazil and only speaking Portuguese, but that's just to me, right? Like, I don't put that standard on other people.